Welcome back to the Developer Odyssey, episode number 8, entitled Tool Time. Now, if you happen to be a child of the 90s like I am, Tool Time will mean something very specific to you.
Does everybody know what time it is?
Hi, Tim the Tool Man Taylor.
That's not the type of tools we're going to be dealing with today. We're going to be looking at tools that you're going to need as a software developer or as a web application developer, or a website developer. Some of these tools that are going to be important for you in order to be able to do your job and to do it well. And again, this is kind of a high level overview. I'll give you my opinion on some things. But this is really just to again kind of get you familiar with terminology, familiar with what certain things are that you're going to be interacting with. And so we're just going to do some high level overviews of some of these topics. And again, if you have questions about any of them or would like me to cover any of them in more depth in a future video, please leave me a comment below. If this is the first video that you're seeing in this series, absolutely check out the link in the description. That'll take you to the playlist, as this has been going on for a while. As I said, this is episode 8. So that'll give you a link back to the beginning. You can see everything that we've gone through so far. And of course, you can always jump around from episode to episode if you desire. Okay, so what are some of the things that you're going to need if you're going to be a developer? Specifically, again, we're focusing on website and web application development. And even in that world, man, there's a lot of choices that you could make just depending on the languages that you're doing and the direction that you're going, which part you want to be on, whether it's the front end or the back end, or as we talked about in episode 7, the client or the server side programming. So there's a lot of things that could impact your choices in some of these areas. But I just want to kind of give you an idea of some of the terminology, some of the options that are out there, so you know, at least have some input in making some of those decisions and are familiar with some of the terminology as you get into it in more detail for yourself or through training and things like that. So the first thing that you're going to need is a computer. And I know that you can do lots of cool things on phones and on tablets. Believe me, I've actually looked into doing development on an iPad Pro because of the mobility factor and screen size and all that stuff, and ability to aircast and all those things. But really, if you're going to be serious about development, you're going to be doing this for 8+ hours a day sometimes, you're going to want a good computer. And what do I mean by a good computer? Well, let me just show you real fast on bestbuy.com. This is a website here in the United States that I often will go to buy computers, especially cheap computers. I've bought a few computers from them, some for my children to learn coding and things like that. I'll give you what I recommend. I've done less at times, and I definitely have done more at times, but I'll give you my recommendations here. So you can do this on a laptop. I would suggest, if you're going to use a laptop, that you at least get one monitor that you can connect to it, just so that you have some more screen space. Yes, they make some good sized computer screens for laptops these days, but there's just something about that laptop and having another screen to be able to write code and see what you're doing on a separate screen that really makes an impact in your ability to do things well. So I would say, if you're going to do a laptop, get a separate screen. And really, if you're going to do a desktop, get 2 screens if you can, because it'll just really help with your productivity. I typically do most of my development on laptops just because I like to be able to take it with me wherever I'm at. And so I would prefer using a laptop. But if you're a desktop person, if you know you're going to be in the same place most of the time, desktop's perfectly fine. And you can see these can get pretty cheap, but let me just kind of talk through, again, this is some interesting stuff here, but let's just take a look at, I'm a Mac guy. If you haven't been able to tell, I prefer Macs, but they are expensive, and I know that. So let's take a look at something that is not a Mac here. Let's take a look at this guy right here. So Windows 11, again, perfectly fine. Now this one right here, this, I'm going to increase the size here. So this HP Envy has 8 gigs of memory, 256 gigabytes of SSD, that's solid state drive. So that's 256 gigabytes of space. Now, A lot of times these days, you don't need as much space on your actual computer unless you're doing things like video editing or you're doing things like working with images and stuff like that. And if you're working with some of the other tools we're going to talk about in this video, then you probably don't need tons and tons of memory. 256 might be a little bit low. I would go probably about 500 gigabytes if you can. If you can afford that, you could get by with 256 gigabytes. But I would try more like 512 or something like that. This one here's got 1 terabyte. I'm trying to find something that's, yeah, 512 gigabytes would be kind of the next option up there. But the big thing, especially if you start getting into hosting websites while you're developing them, if you're running a specific development environment, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, you're going to want at least 16 gigabytes of RAM, because that RAM, that random access memory, it's going to get eaten up and used up really quickly based on what you're doing. And the different tools that you're using can really eat into the usage of that RAM. So when it has this 8 gigabytes of memory, that's talking about the RAM, the random access memory. I would not go down to 8 gigabytes. I would do a minimum of 16 gigabytes. This one here is 32 gigabytes. It's also $2,399. So that's a lot of money to spend on a computer, in my opinion, especially a Dell. If you're going to spend that kind of money, buy a MacBook. So that's my opinion, unfiltered opinion. But there's lots of options here. Obviously, lots of price ranges. This one here is $429. It's got 16 gigabytes of memory. Again, in my opinion, 16 is the minimum. I really would go with 32 if you possibly can, or higher, obviously. But 16 really is kind of the minimum that I would do. When it comes to your graphics card, things like that, for web development, that's really not that big of an issue. That's more if you're going to be doing like game development, things like that. You're going to want some really high priced computers in order to be able to deal with that, because you're going to need lots of RAM, lots of space, really good graphics in order to handle all that rendering power. So this is, again, we're focusing on web development. You can get by doing most of your web development with 16 gigabytes of RAM, maybe a 512 gigabytes of hard drive space, and just whatever the graphics card is. It's really not going to make that much of a difference to you when you're buying a computer. But obviously, you have to have a computer in order to be a developer. You need something to write code on, because that's what we do, is we write code. Okay, so once you've got your computer, then you're going to need at least a couple pieces of software if you're going to do web development or web application development. And the first one is one that's going to come with your computer, and that's a web browser. Now, if you've got a MacBook, it's going to come with Safari. I don't really care for Safari. That's just my personal opinion. I don't really like it that much. If you're coming with a Windows machine, then you're probably going to have something like Edge. But my recommendation is the Google Chrome browser. I just feel like the developer tools on that are the best developer tools out there. And so even though a lot of them are very similar between the Safari and Firefox is another browser a lot of developers use as well. But my suggestion is Chrome. That's what I would go with if I were you. That's what I would suggest. That's what I think most of my colleagues use for the most part. Even those who are weirdos and they use Linux, they often use Chrome for Linux as well. But yeah, you're going to need a computer. You're going to need a web browser in order to actually see what it is that you're developing. And then in order to write the code, you're going to need some sort of text editor or development environment. My preferred editor is Visual Studio Code. I've actually used a lot of them over the years. In fact, my very first editor was actually Notepad, which was literally just like almost like a notepad. I mean, you just had your text on there and it ran or it didn't run. There wasn't a whole lot of feedback, but they're a whole lot more verbose and helpful to these days. And that means they're a little bit more complicated too. So maybe we'll do an overview of Visual Studio Code at some point, and that'll be very similar with a lot of the other ones out there. They're all very similar. Some other popular ones that I've used before are Atom, Sublime Text, and then there's some that are going to be maybe required by your company. So depending on who you're working for, they may have a certain standard. They may provide a certain editor that they prefer that you use, especially if you're programming in a specific language. So if you're using PHP, a lot of people like PHP Storm, which is, I believe, put out by IntelliJ. There's also other specific ones for like .NET developers, for Java developers that are just tailored a little bit more for working with that language. Visual Studio Code works with all of them. For the most part, you can write code for almost any programming language in almost any code editor. But this would be my preference, and that's Visual Studio Code. You'll see this a lot. Most of the tutorials you're watching probably are using Visual Studio Code. So you should be very familiar with it if you're watching videos that are showing coding and tutorials and things like that. Okay, so you've got your computer, you've got your web browser, you've got your code editor, and you're ready to start working. But you might need one more thing, and that's a development environment. What do I mean by that? Well, you might need to basically run a web server on your computer, or you may need to access a web server and be able to push your code up there. That's a little bit more complicated. If you're doing web design in what's called the LAMP stack, which stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, then there's a really good one here called XAMPP. If you are on a Windows machine or a Linux machine, it looks like they've actually got XAMPP for OS X now. I did not know that. That's interesting. But XAMPP is basically a development environment for you to actually run a web server on your computer while you're developing. So you'd be able to actually make changes on the backend server side and be able to see that actually change without having to push your code up to a server somewhere and wait for it to be deployed and all that stuff. You can actually do everything right there on your computer. Now, if you're doing mostly JavaScript development, there will be a different process that you would go through to run Node probably locally on your machine. Or if you're just doing front-end development, you may not need any of these things. There may be some other things that you will need depending on what your company requires from a development environment standpoint. A lot of people use Docker or other tools to be able to run their applications or multiple pieces of their application on their computer while they're developing. So there's lots of different options out there, but if you're doing something fairly straightforward, I would suggest something like XAMPP, or if you're on a Mac, maybe kind of the alternative MAMP is an option there as well. There are some other things out there again, but this, I would probably go XAMPP or MAMP if you're doing something locally, unless you have something really specific that you need something else for, or if you're using languages that don't work with XAMPP or MAMP, then you might need to go a different route there as well. So that's basically everything that you need to really get started on your computer. But there's some other tools that you're going to need if you really want to do things well, and especially if you're going to be working with other people on a team. Probably the most important thing that you're going to need is a repository. Now, there's lots of different places you can go. We've got GitHub here. You've probably heard that term before. GitHub was designed originally as a code repository where you can keep your code. You can push up different branches of your code and kind of keep track of different versions of your code. So that you know who made changes and when changes were made, and so you can even roll back your changes sometimes if necessary. And so you can allow multiple team members to work and only pull in the changes that you want to pull in from different team members as you go through the process of building your website or your web application or whatever other project you might be working on. Bitbucket is another popular option out there besides GitHub. And again, there are others out there too. These are just a couple of options here that I've used in the past. But they do a lot more than that these days. They include some continuous integration, continuous development workflows, and we're not going to talk about that right here in this video. But they incorporate a lot of other tools that you can use to manage your workflow and your deployment of your code and things like that. So these are much more than just repositories for your code. They get pretty crazy in all the different things that they can do. But you're definitely going to want to set up some sort of repository, some sort of version control for your code, especially if you're going to work with other team members. And quite frankly, I do that for my own projects now just because I don't like to store everything on my computer forever. This allows me to store it up in the cloud in somebody else's server space, and I can pull it down on any machine that I'm working on from now till I get tired of it and don't use it anymore. So repositories are very useful for saving storage on your machine, as well as keeping track of where you've been in your project and where you're going in the future. Another really important thing you're going to need for your team is some sort of communication tool. Again, there's lots of options here. The one that I've used the most, though, is Slack. And Slack just makes it easy for you to create channels and invite people to your organization and organize them in specific channels for communication, direct messages, things like that. You can use text messages, you can use email. Those things all still work, but this is kind of one place where you can go and everybody can communicate and collaborate. And this is the one that I've used the most. So this is the one that I typically suggest people use. But again, there's lots of options out there. See whatever works best for you. The next thing on the list, and I even use this for my own stuff when it's just me developing, but especially if you've got a team, you want some sort of project management or task management platform. Now, you can do this in a Google spreadsheet if you want, or an Excel spreadsheet or something. You can do all of these things other ways, cheaper ways. Some of this stuff is free, some of it's paid, but I recommend something like Trello. It's free. You can create little cards for all the different things that you want to do, and you can move those cards. You can create your own columns of processes. Usually you have something like to do, working on, or doing, PR created, QA done, all these different columns. You can create your own workflows basically of how you want to work on your project. And these there are paid versions of Trello, but this is just a free one that's pretty simple to learn and start using and invite other people to participate in. I even use this for non-coding groups that I have doing different tasks that we need to do from time to time. So I would recommend using something like this, like Trello, or if your company uses something like Jira or some other ticketing system, something to keep track of what work is needing to be done, what work is currently being done, and what has been finished, is a good thing to do, especially when you're starting out, even when you're learning from the very beginning. Go through this process of writing your own tickets of the things that you want to do, and then keeping track of that process. And plus it gives you something you can go back and look at and see all the different things that you've learned and studied along the way. So I recommend doing this for your learning process. I recommend doing it just so you kind of get used to that project idea and that project process, because you're going to see that in most companies that you work for these days. Okay, last but not least, of course, one of your biggest tools is Google or Bing or whatever you use for your search engine. And a lot of the links that you click on are going to take you to Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is an awesome website where you can get a lot of help. And really, most of the time, I find questions have already been asked that I'm looking for answers, and they've already been answered. So I can just get the answers pretty quickly to questions that I have. And so Stack Overflow, I tell people that Stack Overflow is like another developer on my team, because that's where everybody goes to get the information that they need. Sometimes people copy and paste directly from Stack Overflow. That can work, but I really highly recommend that you just use it to understand something and then go back and write the code yourself. Unfortunately, there's a lot of code bases out there that have a lot of code written by Stack Overflow answers. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a great code base. There's a lot of great answers out there, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect solution for what you're trying to build. So learn from Stack Overflow, get answers from Stack Overflow, but don't just copy and paste from Stack Overflow into your project. Of course, nowadays we've got AI. There's things like Copilot from GitHub or ChatGPT, where you can ask questions or start writing commands and it will give you code. Again, I don't recommend that you do that as a junior developer, because you don't know enough to know how good that code suggestion actually is. I've seen good code suggestions and I've seen really, really bad code suggestions. And quite frankly, I actually found out that there's jobs for developers to help AI learn how to write better code by basically writing the answers. So that tells you right there that you've got a lot of developers who all have their own opinions about how things should be written a lot of times, and they are the ones giving the answers to AI so AI can give the answers to you. So while those tools are really cool, I would still very much caution the use of them in any important work that you're doing for a job or for your own just learning process. Okay, so that's most of the tools that you're going to need in order to be a web developer or a web application developer, and even some other type of developers. Those are kind of the important tools that you're going to need on your own or even working as a team. So hopefully you're a little bit more familiar with some of those concepts, some of those terms, some of those names of applications and things like that. When somebody throws that out there, you have an idea of what that is, and you have an idea of what you need in order to be successful as a developer. As always, if you're finding this series helpful, if you would click the like button, I would greatly appreciate it. It helps Google know that people are finding this information helpful, and to help recommend it to other people who might be looking for similar information as well. Of course, if you're not subscribed and you're finding this information helpful, please click the subscribe button. We're trying to hit to 5,000 subscribers in the year of 2024. So we're just starting out 2024 and we're not quite to 1,000 yet. So we've got a long way to go, but we've also got the whole year. But you can help us out if you're not subscribed by subscribing to the channel here as we're working towards 5,000 subscribers. But again, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you'd like me to expand upon in a future video, either in this series or in a standalone video, leave a comment below and let me know what that is that you would like to learn more about, and I'll certainly take that under advisement. We also have a Discord channel if you'd like to jump in there. The link should be in the description as well. You can always leave a comment there for future videos or live streams or series ideas and things like that. So that wraps it up for Developer Odyssey episode number 8, and I'll see you on the next one.